Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone online, and welcome to the first MPC seminar of 2024. Today, we have a very important topic, something that gets talked about a lot, migrant and non-migrant views on immigration in Europe by Dr. Lenka Dražanová. And before we get started, I'm just going to read some of the highlights of this great biography from Lenka here. So, Lenka is a research fellow at the MPC and at the Observatory of Public Attitudes to Migration. She received her PhD in political science from the Berlin Graduate School of Social Sciences at Humboldt University in Berlin in 2016. She also holds degrees from Central European University and Charles University. She is currently working on whether we can really identify a shift towards less tolerant populist and nationalist attitudes, societies, and politics in Europe, and if we can, what explains these changes. She also focuses on comparative political behavior and recently published a book, Education and Tolerance. And at the MPC, she works on a number of research projects, so specifically the It Flows project on reception, relocation, settlement, and integration of migrants, exploring effective messaging on immigration, the eMindful project, and the use of new technologies in asylum and migration governance as part of the AFAR project. And Lenka is also one of the experts at the MPC on public attitudes to migration more generally, which she's going to be talking about today. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Lenka, if you're ready.
Thank you so much, James, for this kind introduction. So what I will be presenting today is a paper co-authored with Michaela Širović from University College London. And as was already mentioned, we focus on migrant and non-migrant views on immigration in Europe. So what is the research gap? We usually, when we study attitudes towards migration, we actually focus on the non-migrant residents' perspective. So whether native populations or people born in the country would allow more or less immigrants to the country. In the literature, there's a blind spot in understanding these attitudes from the perspective of immigrants and their descendants. And why is this actually important is that, well, first of all, of course, immigrants are a specific population and electorate. So it might be that factors affecting attitudes of this specific population might be different from the native population. It also, since new immigrants are potentially becoming new citizens of their country of residence, their attitudes might actually affect also other immigrants, the ones that want to come into the country. And of course, these new immigrants also are becoming a new electorate in general. And so it is important to understand overall their electorates, their preferences and policy supports. So I start directly with our first research question, which is basically where we ask whether the first and second generation immigrants' attitudes towards immigration are the same or whether they significantly differ from those of the non-migrant population. From the theoretical perspective, there are two opposing predictions how this can go. One is the intergroup solidarity theory, where basically this argues that immigrants should be more favorable towards other migrants because they can identify more strongly due to their own migration history and outgroup status with the newcomers. So basically, also, there has been some research showing that migrants and other minorities that share the same religion and have more contact between themselves also manifest more positive attitudes towards each other. On the other hand, we also have intergroup competition theory, which would argue that actually immigrants should be more opposed to new immigrants coming to the country due to perceived scarcity, whether actually real or just perceived, and competition for resources in the economic or cultural sphere. So basically, to put it bluntly, it would be the last one shut the door. We are here and now we don't want any more people to come to the country. So for this reason, we have basically two opposing hypotheses. The one based on intergroup solidarity would argue that the first and second generation migrants would be significantly more positive towards immigration compared to the non-migrant population. And also that the first generation should be more favorable to immigration compared to the second generation of immigrants. And on the other hand, based on intergroup competition, we could expect that first and second generation migrants would be significantly more negative towards immigration compared to the native population. And as well, first generation should be significantly more negative compared to the second generation of immigrants. The second research question we ask in this paper is whether factors that are usually associated with attitudes to migration of the non-migrant population are exactly the same as for those first and second generation migrants. And here we specifically focus on stigmatization of one's social identity. So for example, a perceived unfair treatment, being an ethnic minority or speaking the non-national language at home, and whether this actually translates into intergroup solidarity and empathy, or as I mentioned previously, rather to threat competition. What we ask specifically here is also whether these factors affect the non-immigrants' attitudes towards immigration differently compared to the immigrants' attitudes. So whether these factors work the same for all these different groups. So once again, this is a very similar theoretical framework. So based on solidarity, we would expect that people who feel a little bit historically disadvantaged or marginalized would actually have more positive attitudes, and people who, due to competition, it could go the other direction and actually would be more negative. So these vulnerable groups would be more negative towards immigration. So here are the hypotheses that I just mentioned, and our third research question actually asks whether first-generation immigrants' attitudes towards immigration converge with those of the non-migrant population after they live long enough in their host country. So basically what we are after is that whether we can see some sort of convergence of attitudes after a long time has passed as an immigrant lives in his destination country. And based on previous research, we expect that actually attitudes would be converging a little bit. So for example, in the US, Becker showed that the second and third generations attitudes converge towards non-migrants. Also, even in the European Union, it was shown that this is usually the case. And also this is not only regarding attitudes to immigration, but also regarding other types of attitudes. So for example, Jérôme Gonon, who is also my co-author in other papers, and Lopolito showed that basically while immigrant population tend to be very different in their political attitudes in general, longer they stay in the country, more they converge to the overall average of their destination country. So therefore, we do expect that more time passes as first-generation immigrants stay in the country, more their attitudes become either negative or positive, because we don't know how our first hypothesis is going to go. So more they converge to the non-native population. So other contribution in this paper is that we actually look at three groups of population. We look at the non-migrant population, the first generation, and the second generation. Of course, how we measure first generation, second generation, it's not perfect. It never is. So we try to do it as most research does it. So for example, non-migrants, how we define them are people who were born in the country and both of their parents were also born in the country and are also citizens of the country. The first generation are people who were not born in the country and neither of their parents has been born in the country, whereas the second generation are people who were born in the country, but at least one of their parents was not. So we are aware this is not a perfect classification. Of course, there can be people who are not born in the country and would still be classified as native or non-migrant populations. But well, we always have to make this call. Otherwise, it would be just impossible to classify anyone like this. So we also look at is then the variation association for individual level characteristics of potential stigmatization. So whether you feel discriminated, whether you actually are some ethnic minority or language minority in your own country. We look at 6 different types of attitudes to migration. And in our sample, we also include new destination countries from Central and Southeastern Europe, which is usually not the case in previous research when they look mostly in Western Europe. So the data we use is European Social Survey, waves 1 to 9. So this covers the years 2002 to 2018. We have 20 European countries. And as I was mentioning already, the sample includes non-migrants, migrants, and the second generation. And then we include as controls potential determinants of migrants' attitudes towards migration, which would be the economic situation related determinants such as education, job, income, unemployment, so on and so forth. And also whether they are citizens of the country, whether they feel as an ethnic minority, whether they experience discrimination, language spoken at home, and length of stay in the destination country. So as we know, there are many attitudes to migration. We in this paper focus on 2 types: attitude towards immigration policy and also attitudes regarding the perceived effects of immigration. So here you can see the 6 specific questions that are asked with regard to attitudes towards immigration policies, whether people would allow more or less immigrants from poorer countries to come and live in the country, whether they would allow immigrants of the same ethnicity or of another ethnicity. And regarding the perceived effects of immigration, people are asked whether they think immigration is good or bad for their country in general, for their country's culture, and for their country's economy. So as far as methods go, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but we can discuss, of course, in more detail with the Q&A if you're interested in this. So basically we use a 3-level, multi-level hierarchical regression model with individuals are nested in country years, and these country years are nested in countries. The full models include a random slope for both generations, so for the first and second generation. And of course, the full models include all explanatory and control variables and also the random slope for the 2 generations. So I am aware that these figures are not very easy to understand, so I will try to walk you through them a little bit. So on the top, so these are the three dependent variables regarding whether you would allow immigrants into the country. So you see on the left, allow different, in the middle, allow same, and on the right, allow poor. On the top, we have the first generation's effect, and on the down, we have the second generation effect. So what these figures mean. So basically, if you look on the upper left hand side, so allow different for the first generation. So this is one figure where you can see the intercept and the slope for the first generation. So every country that is on the right hand side here has an average positive attitudes towards allowing people of different race to come to the country. So we see on the very far right, Sweden, for instance. What this means is that Sweden overall is much more above average compared to all the other countries in the sample in their attitudes to allowing more immigrants of a different race to come. We also see that, for example, Germany is quite above average, Switzerland, and Ireland. On the left, hence every country that is on the left hand side from the vertical line has below average attitudes towards immigration. So for example, the Czech Republic, we see Greece, also Austria is below average here. On the other hand, what is above the horizontal line means that the effect of the first generation on attitudes to immigration is above average compared to those countries that are below the horizontal line, which means that their effect of the first generation is lower than average. So what does this mean? Is, for example, we see on the upper, in the two upper quadrants, we see Greece or Portugal. So that means that being from the first generation of immigrants has above average effect on your attitudes to immigration. Whereas, for example, we see that in Sweden, who as a country has a much higher attitudes towards immigration compared to the sample in Europe, being from the first generation has a very low effect on people's attitudes to migration. So I hope I managed to explain this a little bit. Of course, then you can, in the Q&A, you can ask me more if, in case I wasn't very clear about this. What we see here and what I want to point out is that actually, for example, in the 2004 EU enlargement countries, you see that there are much stronger effects of belonging to the first generation on the difference in attitudes compared to the second generation. So, for example, you see that while in Czech Republic it is above average, that you are more positive towards immigration if you are from the first generation, it actually does not have a very strong effect being from the second generation in this country on your attitudes to migration. And so the same goes for the attitudes towards the perceived effect of immigration. Once again, this is exactly the same mechanism as I described before. We see here that for the effect of immigration in the 2004 EU enlargement countries, the effect of the first generation is not as strong as we saw on the other types of dependent variables. So now to our second research question, whether perceived discrimination leads to different attitudes among non-migrants and migrant samples. So what you can see here is that while people who are non-migrants, people who are born in the country, actually and feel discriminated, their attitudes towards migrants are more negative or significantly more negative than those who do not perceive discriminated. On the other hand, for example, so what we also find here is that citizenship generally leads to worse attitudes. So not only for the non-migrants, but also for the migrant groups. So once the migrants receive citizenship, their attitudes to immigration worsen. And whereas belonging to an ethnic minority generally leads to more positive attitudes. And again, for the non-migrants, speaking the minority language at home links to worse attitudes. So what this means is that while feelings of discrimination or perceived discrimination or being part of a minority lead to intergroup solidarity among the migrants of the first and second generation, they usually lead to more, let's say, intergroup competition in the non-migrant sample. And once again, belonging to minority linguistic groups differ. As I mentioned, non-migrants and the second generation hold significantly more negative attitudes in the cultural contribution of immigration, whereas the first generation actually hold significantly more positive attitudes if they speak the minority language at home. So we have these differential effects of these variables. And finally, the last question and the last hypothesis we tested is whether it was just done on the first generation sample and whether time spent in country has any significant effect on people's attitudes to migration. And we observed that after 11 or more years spent in the country, the first generation migrants usually worsen in their attitudes to migration. So they're actually converging to the native population. And there's those, and this is all compared to those who just came last year. So if you spent less than 11 years in your country of destination, you usually are significantly more positive towards other migrants. And then after a while, your attitudes worsen and become much more similar to the non-migrant population. On the other hand, this is not valid for all types of attitudes. So, for example, there is no significant difference in attitudes towards those from poorer countries outside of Europe, and nor towards immigration's effect on culture. And what we also look at is where do the immigrant groups come from? So from these first generation migrants, we control for country of origin, not exactly for country, but for the region of origin. And what we actually observed is that also migrants from other than the old EU countries are significantly more negative towards immigration compared to those migrants that come from all the EU countries. So to sum up, we show in this paper that both immigrant groups, the first and second generation, hold significantly different attitudes to immigration compared to the non-migrants, even after controlling for the length of stay in the country. They are different and more positive. So on the other hand, the first generation's attitudes to turn more negative the longer they stay in the destination. However, the pace of this convergence differs for different attitudes measures. So, for example, it is different whether your attitudes change in allowing other immigrants to come, or whether how you perceive the effect of immigration overall. Citizenship predicts worse attitudes, while perceived discrimination predicts more positive attitudes for the migrant population, and worse attitudes for the non-migrant population. Countries differ not only in attitudes to immigration overall on average, but they also differ in their strength of the effect of belonging to the first or second generation of immigrants. So this is another contribution of this paper, because this is usually something not looked at. So the final slide is the take-home points I would like you to take from this presentation. Our results suggest that there is quite a strong loyalty to immigrants persisting across generations. So this intergroup solidarity across different immigrants groups. So there are differences in attitudes towards between immigrants and non-migrants, but also between minorities and majorities. And so there is this intersectionality in minority migrant groups that also should be taken into account. So basically, to give a more representative picture of attitudes to migration in general, it would be worth including also migrants into our research, and which is because this is usually a group that is routinely excluded from quantitative analysis when we conduct these cross-country researches. So this is something I think it would be very important to look at. And we also see that there might be some differences in the integration of these groups across countries in Europe, and maybe there might be some future divide in the immigrant groups population, and some potential migrant-to-migrant hostility might come to place depending on where the migrants come from and how long they have been staying in the country, and whether they consider themselves as a minority or part of the majority after a while. So since this is still work in progress, and this paper is currently under review, so I'm very much looking forward to your feedback, because there's still a chance that we might take into account all the questions and comments. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm ready to take the questions.
Thank you, Lenka. That was absolutely fascinating presentation. And I mean, the topic is something that's talked about in attitudes to immigration in the literature so much. And I think that this is a paper that can make a big contribution. I have a few points and a few questions, but I think I'm just going to save those for now and just open it up to the floor, because we have a lot of people online and we also have quite a few people in the room. So I don't know if anyone online or in the room has a question to kick things off. Andrew?
But oh, sorry. So it's really interesting work, and I must admit I didn't have time to read the paper, so I'm sorry, this might be a point you've already covered. But I kind of is thinking about the intuition informing this and the kind of how this is all working, because one thing I noticed, and it's quite just impressionistic, is quite significant, what seemed to be quite consistent cross-country differences. So when you began to look at the country variables, I saw quite consistent. Greece and Sweden, for instance, really struck me. They really always exist at very opposite ends here. And so with these consistent cross-country differences, I wondered how this fits into your explanation, because you're looking, it seems to me to suggest that there may be country level factors that are playing a part here, and Greece and Sweden seem to me, just by quite impressionistically, to really indicate something quite significant, which might also have theoretical implications, because we're talking about attitudes to migration in Europe here, but actually we're seeing quite significant diversity. And I suppose the question is the extent to which that is consistent, and then maybe part of your account. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll just take one or two more if there are any in the room or online. If not, I'm just going to take the opportunity to ask a few questions now. So I thought it was a great paper, and there's a lot there. I mean, you really offer a lot of results. That's sort of the main thing that one notices straight away. And a lot of it's very useful. I mean, I would say it's so expansive empirically that it's almost like a project rather than just simply a paper. I just want to go back to a bit earlier, though, where you frame the theory basically as solidarity versus competition. And I completely understand why you would do that, because the literature really does that. But I know, I think both of us would agree, knowing your work as well, that that's really treating attitudes to immigration as strictly about immigration, rather than embedded within a broader psychological pattern of attitudes to all sorts of things. People who are pro-immigration tend to have a clear attitudinal pattern to all sorts of issues. And I just wonder if that would be a better grounding, like thinking in terms of those sort of socialization and psychological predispositions grounding, because obviously being an immigrant is a socialization experience above everything else. And I just, from a lot of the findings, I kept going back to that rather than it really being about economic competition, despite the literature talking about that so much. The other thing, I was really happy to see that you broke things down by type of attitude empirically. I just wonder if it would be useful to break things down by type of migrant as well, because where you'd be able to leverage causal insights would be if you could find some groups that are going in opposite directions, and then you could think about why. So if there are people from certain regions of the world or have certain statuses, or I don't know what, who are going in a different direction, then that might be able to offer clues as to the mechanisms going on. Okay, and then, as I said, I mean, I'll leave it at that really, but there are a lot of really interesting findings in there. So, for example, I thought the discrimination finding alone, just that interaction effect alone, could be a paper, you know? And there's a few examples of that without going into it too much. I also think the graphs, I mean, in the paper, they work quite well, but in a presentation, I guess you would agree, it's not massively intuitive. So, yeah, I'll just leave it there for now. We have time for another question if anyone wants to, before I hand over to Lenka.
Okay, thank you so much for these questions. So I fully agree, Andrew, that there might be, or there for sure are country level factors also playing a role here, in the sense like at least we might be controlling for them. So in this paper specifically, because there is so much already, so we did not want to concentrate on these because that would add some more complications. So we might use them as a control. On the other hand, we actually really look at country years. So we have Greece from in 2002, in 2004, in 2006, as we do Sweden, and so we do have all these time points. So things that are time invariant are kind of controlled for already. So this would be only things that change in time are not accounted for at the country level here. So this might be probably a next step, I assume, because it would be interesting to also look at some cross-level interactions on what country factors might affect also the effects of the first and second generation. And definitely there might be something there. I agree. I wonder whether more in practical terms, it would make sense to add it to this paper as well, because it is already quite heavy. And this was one of the critiques of the reviewers we also get, is that there is too much in for one paper. So this would be my concern, but otherwise I think this is a very good point. The psychological patterns and the socialization, I think this is a very good suggestion. The big question is if it is doable empirically, because we actually don't know where these people were socialized. So we from the data, we don't know whether they were already socialized in the country of destination or whether they were socialized in their original country, and which might be quite different, right? If you came as a child, or if you, I mean, we could deduct that because we know how many years people spent in the country, and we also know how old they are. So we could, by subtraction, we could find out whether they came as a child or as an adult, which is, I think this is something that might be worth exploring, whether there's a difference between people that came as children or people that came as adults, and whether there is a difference. So I thank you for this suggestion. I think it's a very good one, actually, and something that we might look at.
But could I just?
Yeah, sure.
So yes, you could do an empirical, but I was thinking more theoretical. So the headline finding, which has been shown before, is that immigrants are more pro-immigration, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's great, but if you go down the route, this sort of economics route of it's theoretically of it's solidarity or competition, then you would deduce from that, oh, they feel solidarity.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say, no, they're just more left-wing, like on lots of stuff. So that's why they're more pro-immigration, not that they necessarily feel some special solidarity. I don't know if empirically you could deal with that with simply controlling for ideology.
But previous research, also, for example, Jerome's, by the way, shows that they are not more left-wing, much more immigrants, especially, for example, coming from Arab or Middle East, are very conservative, non-left-wing.
They vote for left-wing parties and they identify on the left. Even if on actual social issues, they tend to be, some groups tend to be more right-wing. Another reason to break it down by origin.
Yes, which we do control for, actually. We do control for, and we cannot control for the country, but just region, because we don't have enough people for each country, of course. But so we divide them by, let's say, Australia and old EU and so on. So we do control for that, and we just find that mostly people from old EU countries are more pro-immigration, which would probably go with what you are arguing. Yes, so basically you are saying it's not about solidarity, it's much more about, in general, worldviews.
Well, solidarity suggests like a very specific mechanism about immigration, but then there's probably a bit of that going on. But I think theoretically that's quite thin, rather than what's going on deeper underneath, which is that if you look on their views to pretty much everything, civil, maybe not civil liberties, but let's say redistribution, all kinds of things, they're going to be generally more left-wing. So the point of that is that if you took that person without knowing if they're an immigrant or not, have an immigrant background or not, you would expect them to be pro-immigration anyway, before you even know about that thing. So that means they're probably isolating the immigrant component that well. But as I say, I don't think you need to change the empirics. I just think that, unfortunately, the literature has gone down the solidarity versus competition way of thinking. And we know that attitudes are much not so issue specific as that. They're embedded in a web of a so-called web of implications in terms of other attitudes.
I think, I think you're completely right. This is because basically how this all started if I may, is that me and my co-author, but also my we were actually very surprised when we were presenting another unrelated paper, and people were arguing, oh, but it's possible that immigrants are more against immigration. And we never thought about it because we would always expect immigrants to be more pro-immigration. And this is how this original idea started, because, and then that's why we framed, because we were like, why would they be against migration? And so this is where this competition came into play, because theoretically we couldn't justify this, because for us it was always dealing with attitudes to migration. Originally it was quite clear that immigrants are going to be more pro-immigration, and then but we wanted to check this empirically. And so when we had to justify why we are actually even doing this, that's where this theory of competition came in. But maybe you're right, we could also frame it in a different way.
Okay. So do we have any other questions in the room, or we have one question online? So let's go with Julia before I take some questions online.
Thank you so much, Lenka, for this fascinating presentation. I remember we had this talk a couple of months ago, and thank you so much for actually doing this. I have a question traditionally about the gender difference. So is there a difference between male and female migrants and their attitudes toward migration? Do you study this? And the second question is, so basically I had the impression that you have like these different categories of migrants that are already in the country, but you see a migration as a phenomenon as a whole. So I understand it would be a very huge project if we start categorizing like those migrants that are coming to the country, but it just made me wonder, is there a difference between attitudes? For example, if I am a Syrian refugee living in Greece already, am I more pro-Syrian migration into the country and against whatever, like Kenyan, let's say? Or is there a difference or not? I don't know if I explained myself clear, but yes, thank you.
Okay, and Martin?
Yeah, just a very small question. This is probably for a different paper, not this one. But I'm just wondering, I mean, if you're interested in socialization and whether the migration experience in a way makes a difference, do you have any data on whether the natives, whether the non-migrants have any previous migration experience? I mean, because that's sometimes an argument made where having been a migrant oneself, whether that ever does that make a difference in a way to how you feel about immigrants in your own country? So I'm wondering whether there's a data point on where you were last year. Maybe there are some recent returnees who you could look at.
So I will start with the last question. So whether you have been a migrant, no, I don't think that in the ESS there is not such a question. There is a question, if I'm not mistaken, whether you lived in a different country. So that could mean 3 months or 30 years. So, but I mean, it is something to control for, definitely, because I think that also can change this life experience, your view. And I'm not sure now, because this is not everything, it wouldn't fit on the slide that we control for. I think we might be already controlling for that, but we cannot go much deeper in the sense, have you been a migrant in the past? That I don't think that's something asked, which would be also interesting. Yes, but I think this is it could work as a proxy, whether you lived in a different country quite well. And to Julia's question, so gender differences, so we do control for gender. We know from also our recent meta-analysis that in general, there is no difference in attitudes in overall in attitudes to immigration between male and female. So they are both the same anti or pro-migrants. What is, for example, there is a difference in voting for the far right, where males tend to vote for the far right much more, but it's not based on attitudes to migration, at least from the academic literature shows that. And so we control for that, but also, as you can see here, there are not that much gender differences, neither in the first and second generation as you see. So not that significant, I would say. And so what you described, we try to do a little bit that in the sense, because how the ESS questions are constructed, so they ask you, would you allow immigrants from poorer countries outside the EU to come here? But these are questions asked for people in Western Europe. So if I'm a German and they ask me, would you allow a Turkish person to come here? As a German, it might have a different significance than if I'm a Turkish person, of course. So like I would allow more Turks in, probably yes, as a Turk, but so basically that's why we control for the origin of the migrants that are being asked this question. The same goes, for example, if you ask about, we do not have this question in our research, but this is usually a problem that, for example, you ask whether you would allow Muslims in the country and the respondent is Muslim themselves. It's very different than if you're a Christian, right? So these questions are sensitive to your own identity. So by controlling for the origin of the migrants, we try to do a little bit that to kind of empirically, not theory, but empirically to kind of allow our models to distinguish between the fact what you are asking and what are you, and in this way we are able to a little bit on average have these answers. But I mean, it's not very specific and very in details but yes, this is a very important point that we thought of. I am not saying we accounted for it perfectly, but we tried our best with what we had. But I think it's a very important point. Yes.
Okay, so I'm gonna just read one of the questions that we've got online from Kristin von Grafer. Thank you so much for the interesting presentation. Your findings: citizenship increases rejection and migration. So Kristin offers the situation: some countries recommend migration naturalization, not expecting a negative effect on the attitude you describe. Their question is, how could we combine your finding with the marketing strategy? So I guess that's sort of like a practical use for your finding of, in terms of persuasive communication. I suppose that they mean, how can we stop naturalization having this negative effects on attitudes?
Well, it depends what's your ultimate goal, because on the other hand, if many countries have as a goal not to allow more immigrants, or so that you just give the ones you already have citizenship and then they will be negative. So that's so it depends what you are after in this sense, because I think this is very important to underline. So citizenship has a negative effect in the sense that immigrants are more positive. So by giving immigrant citizenship, they just become the same as the native. So basically they just so in this sense you are starting from a much more positive starting point. So, and this is something that we find, but I have to admit it is not just us. In the literature, there is quite a lot of literature showing exactly this, that when people obtain citizenship or are natural, then they become a little bit more negative and converge once again to the native population. And in this sense, I would argue it is some sort of competition, in the sense, oh, we made it, and now maybe that's it, and we are now part of this society and don't want anyone else to come. So marketing, I don't know, it really much depends on what you are after, I would say, as a government. So for example, really you might actually want this effect to persist. So I guess it depends on the political reality of the country. I don't have a good answer otherwise.
Okay, anyone else online or in the room? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. The paper is so rich with all the empirical data and your results. I have a lot of thoughts, but one of the questions was also related to the citizenship and its effect. And as you mentioned that there is the higher convergence with the attitudes of the population, non-migrant population. And I was wondering if it's the same in the countries where the attitudes towards migrants were predominantly negative and predominantly positive. So like Greece versus Sweden, whether the convergence would be going the same way towards like more positive attitudes as the non-migrants have and more negative as the non-migrants would have. And then, so in that case, that could also say that maybe there is something else in the picture in addition to the competition versus solidarity. There could be also the effect of living in that country and like learning the language, watching the media, reading the news, getting affected by the political discourses. And so like if it's about not about the attitudes, but about the convergence, maybe there is something else in addition to that. But I was wondering what's your take on that?
No, I think this is a very good point. From the model, from these multi-level models, we are not able to say that. I'm able, I mean, I would be able, not here, I could run this model probably with a random slope, like the same as we did here. I could do that for citizenship. That's an interesting thing. And this, yes, so this I could. Right now, I don't know the answer to that because from the data I have, I am not able to read. So I just know that overall, on average, acquiring a citizenship in this sample of countries, 20 European countries we have, usually leads to more negative attitudes. So this I'm able to say now. And by running different models, I might be able to say a little bit more what you are after, because I think that's probably a little bit beyond the scope of this paper, but I think it's a very interesting and relevant point. And I think what you mentioned, that maybe in countries that are overall much more negative, probably this effect is much stronger. So this also might be the case. I agree.
And then I think we had a question from this side of the room, Claire.
Yes, I was actually going to ask you a similar question about the convergence, but there was just one small point, and I would have, if I'd read the paper, I probably would have seen this. Do you control for the scale of first and second generation immigrants, and does that have any effect? The size of the population, you know, in terms of ratio with the citizen, you know, how large your immigrant population is?
No, we don't control for the share of the immigrant population. We control for things at the individual level. So, for example, whether the immigrants, the first and second generation themselves, what's their level of education, whether they're unemployed, what's their income, and so on. So we control for this because, of course, this might also affect their attitudes to immigration. But we do not control for any, and this goes to a little bit the direction that Andrew was saying. Like, we do not control for any country level factors at this moment. So you say that we should, but we should control only in general. What's the ratio between the natives and things? Yeah, but I mean, like normally we know that countries that have a larger immigrant share tend to be more positive towards immigration. So I would expect that, you know, like this would again have the same effect. But we are really interested in more in the individual level effects rather than country level effects. But I mean, yeah, it could, of course.
It was just because I was interested in connecting that to your comment on majorities, minorities, and when you talked about the intersectionality and whether that might be a way of expanding it, you know, in terms of scale, majorities, minorities, sort of the picture of the population on the whole, and then how that affects your majority, minority analysis, if it does at all.
Yes, but yeah, that might be interesting because we also had a little bit of trouble with the reviewers when we talk about speaking non-minority language at home and everything, because we come from me and my co-author both come from countries with large ethnic minorities that are there for centuries. So, for example, Hungarians in Slovakia. So we do not count them as migrants because they clearly are not. But on the other hand, it's a different situation for them being a Hungarian speaking Hungarian in Slovakia or in Romania than it is for a first generation migrant, right? So basically we and this is something that probably does not is not evident in Western Europe as much as is in this Central Eastern Europe, European part. So we had a little bit trouble explaining what we exactly mean, or we could think, but on the other hand, we could think about the Germans in Italy, in North Italy. So these are the type of groups we have in mind and that we try to control for when we also have these non-majority language spoken at home, what we measure there. And it is interesting that we find a very differential effect for the non-migrant population when these tend to be much more negative actually than those that are actually also migrants and usually speak their language because that's the language not of their parents, basically.
Okay, so we have one more question online. So they ask, they would be interested in the social connections and level of integration of immigrants. So do you have information about how immigrants are connected to members of the native society, e.g. the one you integrate on language spoken at home? They assume that this could also vary their attitudes. So basically, how does level of integration interact with this immigration status?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Well, we, for example, as you can also see here, we measure in general, for example, how often does the respondent meet socially. That does not necessarily mean they could also meet within their own migrant group. So that's true. So that we cannot disentangle whether they are meeting with the non-migrant population and whether they're meeting with the very small migrant population. That's hard to disentangle. But for example, we control for different things such as socioeconomic status and education, and we assume that people with higher education and higher socioeconomic status are more integrated in the society because they spend more time, of course, also in the institutional settings of the country. So these are proxies, I would call because also it's hard to measure, right, the level of integration at the individual level, because you can ask a person how well do you feel integrated, then of course it's a subjective thing. But for example, when you ask whether they feel discriminated, which we have, I think that's also a proxy for integration. If you do not feel discriminated, I would assume you probably feel that you are well integrated in the society. So we have different proxies to measure this. I would say it's not perfect, but I don't know how else would we measure this in any other possible way.
Okay. Yep.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to ask a question. I think it could fall under perceived effects of the attitude. I mean, on economical impact. Around technology. I think this week the IMF released a report about AI and jobs. And we think about a number of countries trying to race towards being dominant in these industries. It means the entire digitalization value chain will start employing people across the board from probably all over the world. So how would this, and a lot of this has come up, especially in the past 12 months, more or less, since the advent of generative AI. So how would this impact your study? Would you add that as a question alongside the economical aspect?
Well, I think it's important to underline that this is the survey we are using is a European social survey, so we do not get to choose the questions being asked. So I have the data, I have the questions, and I have to work with what I have and cannot choose what is being asked. So that's one important, I think, thing to mention. And well, I think what you mentioned is definitely an important point, but in the context of this specific study, we really have people who are migrants living in the, let's call it, destination country. So it's not, we do not have this sample of these digital nomads being somewhere else. And of course, I would imagine that people who are against migration would have much less problems with this. People working from somewhere else for a company in the country than people actually physically coming to the country. I can imagine the reasons why people are opposed to migration are this, but you are correct. Many mention that the reasons are economic, but then if that would be so, they probably should be opposed also to people working from some other country for a company in their own country. So this is an interesting question. I don't think we can, in the context of this study, we cannot, also because there are no such questions in the survey, but it is something that someone might explore further, because I think it is indeed interesting. So thank you.
Okay, great. Do we have any final questions? Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm not very familiar with this literature, but in my personal experience, usually also the way that people enter the country. So if you want to say that the way they would label the immigration status matters for the attitude they have towards immigration and towards what kind of immigration. So what I mean is, for example, someone coming as a political refugee might have different attitudes towards someone coming as a so-called economic migrant or refugee. And I wonder if you have tried in any ways to incorporate these differences in your study. And I would imagine perhaps there is not a question asking the specific things, but I wonder if there is a way to group because you're controlling for regions, for example. So to see if for regions and periods of time that maybe produce more like political refugees or economic migrants, or, you know, like family migration or something like this, if there is any difference in terms of like this kind of more predominant kind of migration types from different regions. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Indeed, there is no such question. I would assume that the majority of people in the sample are labor migrants, or they are not refugees. Also because it's hard to contact. So these are people kind of living in the society when, you know, being part of this survey and mostly there for a little bit longer, having registered. So they're probably very legal migrants also, and so on. So I would imagine this is 99.9% of the people in the sample. So I understand your point, which I think is quite relevant, but I mean, I cannot know for certain because this question is, but I don't imagine how would they find these. For example, they definitely did not survey illegal immigrants for this survey. I'm pretty sure about that. That's correct. Yeah. I mean, there may be some methodological way how to try, but it's imperfect again, because that's a supposition, which I would agree with what you are saying, but we will never know unless we would ask the person. So, but I mean, it's also indeed a good point. But I think for this we would need another type of data, and with specifically oversampling the migrant population, which is very hard to find this kind of data, and so this would be an appeal also if someone wants to collect data on this population. That would be great, actually, for all of us, I think.
Okay, so just quick last question.
Yes, indeed, very quick. I was just wondering if you noticed any difference at all between the Eastern European countries and the Western European countries that you looked at. And if that is so, what would that be? How do you interpret it?
Well, the difference is here, the non-surprising difference, I would say that overall the Central Eastern European countries tend to be more negative towards migration than compared to the Western European countries. So in this sense, I think there's difference, but not such a surprise. What is a little bit of a difference, what seems also, you can see it here, that being a first generation migrant in these countries has a much more stronger effects on positive attitudes to migration compared to what effect it has in Western European countries, as you can see from these figures, and also for the second generation. So being a migrant in these countries affects you positively much more than it does affect you in Western European countries. So this is one of the findings that we try to highlight a little bit in the paper, because usually we do not see this type of research in Central Eastern Europe. So this was one additional contribution we tried to make. But on the other hand, this is for allowing people in, other migrants. For the effects of immigration, you see that being migrant, first and second generation, does not have a very big effect. So how you perceive immigration. So there is also this distinction between the type of attitudes. Yes.
Okay, I think that's all we have time for today. Lenka, thank you so much for a great presentation. So many insights there, and I think that you can get a couple of papers out of this project, to be honest. And also thanks for all the questions, everyone online and in the room. So I'll just end it with an applause for Lenka. Thank you so much. And then if there are any more questions for the people online or in the room, I suppose people in the room can maybe come up to you now and ask, and then I'm sure people online can send you an email with any further questions. So thank you very much, everyone.